Are we ready? Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Diane from the Park City Museum. Thanks for coming tonight. A couple things coming up. We are doing our home tour this year, so I'm just trying to get the word out. It will be June 21st, so keep looking for that information coming out soon. If you're not a member and would like to be a member, please let me know. You can go online and sign up if you want, or I do have forms that I can give people so you can see the different membership levels. Okay, so that's what I was supposed to announce tonight. Yeah. So Dorian De Maio has been here quite a few times in the past. He has done a whole lecture series on how the West was won, including Lewis and Clark and the Oregon Trail, which we'll hear tonight. And then he has also done Mountain Men, right? And a couple other lectures for us. So he lives in Park City part-time, and he is a pilot. So some of these photos that you might see tonight are from his plane, which is very interesting. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dorian. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. Can you hear me back there? All right, good. Hey, I'm just curious. Has anybody else seen this presentation before? Oh, yeah, I know Ken. I know you have as well. Well, I am Dorian, and welcome, and I'm pleased that you can join me on this trip tonight. We got quite a journey ahead of us. Now, let me start by saying that when I was a young boy, growing up in an inner city in New Jersey, I would wake up, I would open up the blinds to my window, and I would look out 50 feet of weeded lot, and then I would see a roofing factory. So on Saturdays when the Western serials came on, I really looked forward to seeing a place where I could see horizons and I can see mountains. And oh, here we go. We can't get this quite. There we go. So when I retired, I had an opportunity to buy an airplane, and I like to explore the West. I like to see where history is made. And you're going to see where history is made as well from the air and also from the ground. Thank you. I should tell you that I am not a history professor. I'm not trained in history. I'm actually a former aerospace engineer, just a guy who likes to fly around and share what I've learned. But you all know your history pretty well. So if there's something you want to add to the conversation, just pipe up. What better place to start exploring the West than the Lewis and Clark Trail? And as you all know, Lewis and Clark and the Cora discovery were the first Americans to cross the continent to the Pacific Ocean and return. And when they did, they came back with reports of a vast land filled with all kinds of fur riches, among them the American beaver. And at about that time, this popular fashion was taking off, both in this country as well as in Europe, because it was lined with the inner felt of beaver pelts. Saying that 3 times. Inner felt of beaver pelts, which gave it a nice shiny appearance and also made it waterproof. So men known as mountain men flooded into the West in search of beavers. And these were the men who really explored the West. These are the men who really mapped the West. They were the ones who found all the river valleys, all the principal mountain ranges, all the areas where they were friendly or fighting Indians. This lasted until about the 1830s when the beaver gave out and the fashion turned to silk hats. And that brings us to today, because many of these men either led wagon trains across the West or became scouts for the Army. And by the way, before I came over here, I read an interesting story about this hat. And that was that wearing this hat is supposed to make you more intelligent. So I may need to answer some of your questions. We'll see. But I'm kind of curious myself. The sum of the squares of the sides of a right triangle is equal to the square of the hypotenuse. Wow. I'm going to have to loan this to Scarecrow because he got it wrong, by the way. All right, so we are going to be on the trail. So we're going to go from landmark to landmark tonight. And as we do that, we're going to talk about some of the experiences that the pioneers had. And the Mormon, California, and Oregon trails were basically the same trail until we got to Utah and we got to Idaho. And then I'm going to show you the differences of those trails if we got a little bit of time at the end. In order to inform myself about this, I basically spent the better part of a decade traveling through, I think it was about 7 states, visiting different interpretive centers and historic forts. This is really a good resource. And if you're interested, I'll be happy to tell you later on where some of these places are. Why did people go west? Well, in a short period of time, we had a number of drivers that kept on pushing people west. It all started in the 1830s. There was a revivalist movement and missionary work, in this case to bring religion to the Native Americans. Then, of course, we had the Mormons who were escaping persecution in Illinois and coming to the Promised Land. Financial considerations were a major reason for going west. There were a number of economic recessions and depressions in the 1830s and the 1840s. People really had nothing to lose by just leaving and finding a better land. And then, of course, we had gold discovered in 1849. The 49ers came over, but the 49ers were entirely different. They were largely single men who hoped to make it rich and then go back to the east, as opposed to the pioneer families. And finally, the U.S. government promoted going west, because at the time, the Northwest Territories were in contention with the British, and to a lesser extent, the Russians. And the U.S. government basically wanted to secure the Northwest Territories for itself by eminent domain. And by the way, that worked because you can see Oregon Territory joined the U.S. in 1848. This is what's called the Old Oregon Trail. There were variations of it throughout the years, but we're going to follow the Old Oregon Trail. And I think we're going to try to cover 6 months in 60 minutes. So I will probably try to talk pretty quickly here. There were a number of departure points, but the most common was Independence, Missouri. Everyone wanting to go to the Willamette Valley just south of Portland. Now, before the advent of municipal water supplies, all travel was dictated by the availability of water. So we are going to be following river valleys, and we're basically going to be jumping from river to river, starting with the Big Blue in Kansas, and then jumping on to the Platte, and then the North Platte, and then the Sweetwater River, and then the Green River to some extent, and then the Big Bear River, all the way to, ultimately, to the Columbia River, to the coast. So river to river is the way we're going to travel. We don't really know how many pioneers crossed the country. There were simply no records that were kept. But we think it's somewhere around 300,000. It started with a trickle in the 1840s and then was greatly added to by the Mormons and then the gold rush, and it peaked in 1852. Unfortunately, there was a lot of disease in 1852, so the travel really tapered off right after that. But it continued for another 60 years, even though the Transcontinental Railroad came into being in 1869. People could not afford to bring their entire families and their livestock to the West Coast. The last recorded one was in 1909. Okay, so I want you all to imagine that you have a plot of land in Ohio, and you're having trouble making ends meet. It's not a very good piece of land, and you and the family are not doing very well. So a neighbor comes up to you and he says, "Hey, we're going to get a group of wagons to go west. We hear that there's this land in Oregon country where the plants or the crops just plant themselves and the fish just jump out of the rivers right into your skillet. And would you like to come with us? So you say, sure, why not? You risk it all. You risk the welfare of your family against the possibility of death from disease, from river crossings, from Indians, and from breakdowns. And you've hired me, a former mountain man, to guide you across the country. The first thing we would need to do is we would need to prepare for that. And this was not an inexpensive affair. It's estimated that it cost somewhere between $25,000 and $35,000 just to go west. So you would end up selling a lot of your goods and perhaps borrowing money from your family.
They said in that
Say again?
on you. So
That is today's value. That's today's value. Yep. Thank you for pointing that out. So the first thing we'll need is some food. And you have to be careful because there are a lot of charlatans out there that are more than happy to sell you spoiled food or quality food. But fundamentally, this is going to be a very basic diet, kind of like army rations. It's going to be flour, some form of salted pork, beans, coffee, rice, and probably we'll start off having some fruits and vegetables, fresh, but those will probably last only about a month. We'll take the usual assortment of camping gear, but we'll also want to add some water barrels because there will be dry stretches of the road. Certainly rifles, spare parts, there will be breakdowns. And importantly, we're going to want to take some trade items because we're going to run into some Native Americans who will want to offer us fresh meat in exchange for things like tobacco, blankets, and other trinkets. Now we have to decide what kind of animals we want to take. What would you guys take? Would you take horses, mules, or oxen? Can't hear you. Oxen, yeah. Horses were a poor choice. They really did not have the long-term endurance for a six-month period. If you had mules and you knew how to drive mules, you would probably take mules. But oxen were probably the best choice. They were inexpensive. They could go long distances without water. They could eat the poor grasses of the West. If they died, you could butcher them and eat them. So we'll probably want something like 4 and maybe an extra 2, just as backup. Plus whatever assortment we're going to take of farm stock. What kind of wagon do you think we'll take? Some people say we'll take the Calistoga wagon. Calistoga wagon was really a very heavy freight wagon that was used in Pennsylvania. It weighed something like 3,000 pounds. Far too heavy to be pulled by our animals. So actually a good farm wagon, if it's in good shape, is probably the best choice. And if you didn't have that, you could buy a wagon from Deere, a Studebaker. Here you got to be careful again, because people might try to sell you a wagon made out of greenwood. That greenwood would shrink when we get into the arid west, and our wheels would just pop off. And now we got to decide how we're going to get organized. We probably want to go with groups of people who really feel have some common interest. For example, some people absolutely refused to travel on Sabbath. Some wagon masters insisted on traveling seven days a week. But I'm not like that. I say that we travel 6 days a week because that 1 day of rest makes a big difference for the animals. And we'll probably go as long as those who do travel on 7 days. I'm going to insist that you're all going to sign a covenant. And that covenant will say, for example, that you will obey my command as we go across the country. It will also say that you'll bring spare parts. It will also say that you'll bring some extra money for river crossings on ferries. And I'm also going to insist that you hire an HOA president, because I don't want to deal with your squabbles as we go across the country. That's your business. My job is to get you across the country. And now maybe the most important thing, when do we depart? Too early and all the rivers are swollen. Too late, and all the grasses are hurting. So we're probably going to leave somewhere between mid-April to May. But lucky you, you hired me, and I live in the West, so as I came east to independence, I saw the state of the rivers as well as what Indians are warring. Most of the pioneers didn't really think they were on the trip until they began to see these iconic landmarks. Nothing is more iconic than Chimney Rock, which, by the way, back in the day was about 50 feet higher than it is today, because the United States Army decided to use it for target practice in the late 1800s. So people began getting excited. We're really on our journey now. But notice all the grasses here. In the early part of the trip, buffalo would be in these areas, and that would provide us with some fresh kill. So the eating would be good, at least for the first month or two of the trail. Later on down the road, we're going to come to the famous Scotts Bluff. And the trail, in fact, goes between these two peaks, although there were diversions south where there's a trading post and north, and that's the Platte River up there. This is the trail. You see, it's a swale. It's been heavily traveled, and it continues right between these two peaks. Now, I took a hike up here just for fun, just to see what it was like, and I found it tough going because the soil was very sandy, and my feet kept on sinking in the sand. This was a major problem for the wagons. If they were heavily loaded, which they were at this particular time, then the wheels would sink in the sand. Then it would be really tough going for our animals. So I would insist that you get rid of the non-essential items. So that potbelly stove, get rid of it. That four-post bed and springs, no, we don't need that. That baby grand piano, yes, somebody took that with them. That gets dumped as well. And in fact, it was said that you could follow the trail just by following the debris along there. But we have no choice, because if we don't do that, we're going to wear down our animals. We are traveling in land that the Native Americans called a braskier, or land of the flat water. And here the Platte River kind of empties out, often described as a mile wide and inches deep. For the life of me, I don't know how you drink from this river. Do you use siphons? Do you use straws? I have no idea how you get anything, because this is essentially a swamp at this point in time. But further upriver, the river begins to consolidate, and it divides between the South Platte, which goes to Colorado, and the North Platte, which is what we're taking. Now, we're going to be traveling on the south side of the Platte River. Later on, when the Mormons came, they traveled on the north side. And since they came year after year, they took the time and made the effort to improve the road. And in fact, they built a lot of infrastructure along the trail, including bridges over creeks, and they also installed many ferries. This is an example one later down the trail in Jasper, Wyoming. But crossing these rivers could be tricky. If they were shallow enough, we could just drive right through them. But if they were deeper, we'd have to unload our items, put them on a raft, and take them across the river. Let's talk about the kind of day we're going to have. A typical day on the trail for almost 6 months. We've all seen the movies where people are sitting in the wagon, they're barely singing along, riding on the trail. Well, that's not the case at all. Most of them walked. They walked because there's no room in the wagon. And also these wagons did not have springs. So it was a bone-jarring ride. And you would walk if you had difficulty with your legs, or if you were pregnant. In fact, you would walk just about all the way up to the time that you were ready to give birth. If we go 15 to 20 miles a day for 6 days, we'll actually do it in about 4 months. But we have to allow time for river crossings. We have to allow time for interactions with Indians. We have to allow time for deaths and births and breakdowns. So we're also going to have some planned stops along the way. So we will allow about 2 months for that. So they're definitely going to get your steps in. I think I calculated it's like 30,000 steps in a given day. Up early in the morning, on the trail by 7, a brief period of time at noon, I'll get a snack, and then we'll circle the wagons at 5 o'clock. And the whole purpose of circling the wagons was really to create a corral for our animals. And you did not want to go inside this corral. It was basically a barnyard. So we're going to spend most of our time actually outside the wagons, eating and sleeping. Hygiene was a secondary thought. Some enterprising women brought along tin tubs. They would heat up some water, sell you at an expensive price a bath. The way that would work is that the man would go in, he would take his bath, he would leave. Women would go in and use the same water. Then each of the children would go in and use the same water. Brushing your teeth was pretty straightforward. You had a corn cob, put some baking powder on it. The man would brush his teeth, pass it on to the woman who would brush her teeth, and pass it on to each of the 2 children. And that was their concept of hygiene, like in the pioneers. Coming up now on the famous Fort Laramie of legend. Fort Laramie was originally a fur trapping post used by the mountain men. And it's a chance to buy some supplies and maybe do some repairs on your wagon. And it also had a post office so we could send the letters back home. Later on in the days of the trail, the Army actually patrolled portions of the trail. And most often they were stationed here at Fort Laramie. But most of the pioneers were scared to death when we came here because this place was surrounded by Sioux Indians because the Sioux wanted to trade. And Native Americans were always interested in trading or white man's manufactured goods. So those Indians could destroy those forts at any given time, but then again, would not trade the next year. Some 20 or 30% of the ruts are still visible today, particularly in the dry areas. And this is pretty noticeable here. This is what happens when thousands of wagons pass over this hill made out of sandstone. I don't know what happens if one of the wagons got stuck. I don't know how it would turn around, but these ruts just continue right over this hill. And we're going to see many along the way. Death was, unfortunately, a pretty common occurrence on the trail. It's estimated that 1 in 10 died. If there are 100 people in our wagon train, that means we can expect perhaps 10 to die over the course of our journey, perhaps 1 every 3 weeks. So that death is constantly stalking you. There are many dead ways to die. The ones that we are most familiar with, or we were told, are basically Indian attacks. There were certainly horrific Indian attacks, but less than 400 people actually were killed in the 60 years of travel on the Oregon Trail. Many accidents, these people did not know how to use firearms. They did not know how to safe them, so they quite literally shot themselves in the foot, which would lead to infections and death. And I'm going to insist that whoever's driving the wagon drinks coffee every morning. Anybody want to guess why? Say again? You're all day long, if you're driving your wagon, you're going back and forth like this. Unless you strap yourself in, you will fall out of your wagon and you will get crushed by your wagon. That happens on many occasions. And we're creating a huge dust cloud as we're moving along too. And the children are playing around the wagons. And sadly, many of them were trampled by their own wagons as well. Principal cause of death, of course, was disease. And the worst disease was cholera. Terrible way to die. You would wake up in the morning and feel poorly, and by evening you were dead. And throughout the day you would be bleeding throughout all your orifices. If anyone touched your soiled clothing, there's a good chance they would get cholera as well. Cholera is caused by contamination of water by human and animal feces, the urine. So consider this. Each day we're going to create 2 latrines. One at lunch and went to dinner. And the effluent for those in the trees are going to seep down into the rivers. And we're going to water our animals in the rivers. And of course, defecating and urinating in the rivers. So at peak times of the trail, these rivers were basically open source. If you drank coffee or tea in the morning, then you were okay because you boiled your water. But they didn't really understand that boiling water killed off the germs. But if you just drank water from the river, then it was a little bit like taking a big chance. Now, unfortunately, there were really no places to bury people other than right on the trail itself. And the trail was very hard packed. So people had to dig very shallow graves, and they would bury their loved ones in these graves. And it was not uncommon for people's limbs to be sticking out. You hoped that the passage of all the wagons behind you would tamp down the graves so that the graves would not be desecrated by either the Indians or animals. But you felt terrible about this. So you came back many years later who would erect a gravestone to honor your dead somewhere near the point where you thought they had died. Now, if you lost a spouse, you have a real problem because farming is a family affair. So you either had to go back, or if you wanted to go forward, you had to find a new mate. Your chances or your choices within your own wagon train were very limited. But there were stops along the trail. In fact, one of them was in Mount Pelier, Idaho, where we'll rest for about 4 or 5 days. And that would be a good occasion to meet people, kind of like speed dating in today's terms, and find a spouse. If you were a woman who lost a husband and you had 2 boys, oh boy, everybody would just want to marry you. She came with a workforce. If you had 2 girls, no one would pay attention to you. That's the way it was. I mean, the way it was on the trail was all about practicality. All right, we are now at Fort Laramie, and Casper, Wyoming is over here. And now we're going to go over, and the Platte River basically veers away from the trail. So now we have to go over a stretch of about 40 miles of poor desert where there are nothing but alkaline pools to survive on. And that's going to be difficult on our animals. Our animals, they can smell water from miles away. So they're going to make a beeline for those alkaline pools. And we have to hold them back because they can be poisonous. So by the time we reach our next place, which is Independence Rock, and we taste these waters, it tasted so sweet to us. But of course, this is called the Sweetwater River. And Independence Rock was named because if you reached this point by July 4th, it was believed that you could cross the Oregon Mountains before the snows set in. So this was cause for celebration. And the wagon trains usually formed over here and over here. And from there, it's kind of interesting. It looks almost like an elephant sense, doesn't it? Something like 20 or 30,000 signatures on this rock, all over the rock, including on top of the rock, which I've seen. And I just captured a few of them. This one was made by a cavalryman, and it's hard for me to read that. That's around 1860-something over there. So this was one of the men who actually patrolled the trail. Okay. This one, these people arrived May 29th. So they were fast movers. They were going to get to Oregon pretty quickly. This one I find very interesting. Can you make it out? July 4th, 49. So this was a 49er, no doubt, a single male. Just a few miles down the road, we're going to come to Devil's Gate. Devil's Gate is this cut through the rock formed by the Sweetwater River, but we are not going to go through that. We're going to go through Rattlesnake Pass. And if you walk through this area, it lives up to its name. You'll have to dodge some rattlesnakes here. Now, I took this picture right over here What don't you see in this picture? Don't see any timber. So how are we going to make fires to cook our food? Well, of course, we're going to use buffalo patties. But if we're one of the latter wagon trains, all the area before us has been picked clean. And usually the children were asked to go out and collect buffalo patties at night. So they would range very far to find these things, and many of them got lost. If you were very fortunate, they would be picked up by following trains and reunited with their family at one of these stops that I'm talking about, or be captured by Indians, either enslaved or bartered with one of the wagon trains. Now, on the other side of this is a Mormon interpretive center, which I found very interesting. It celebrates the Mormon hand carts, and I did not know about this. Many of the Mormon travelers from overseas could not afford a wagon. So they would basically buy this fairly inexpensive and a small hand cart, which could carry up to 250 pounds, and just pull it on the entire trail. And there's my very patient wife demonstrating the proper way to pull a cart. These things broke down all the time. Look at the wheels. They're covered in rawhide, covered in iron. So all the people who pull these hand carts often lagged where the wagons were at night. So you'd have to go back and pick them up and help them come back into the wagon train. All right, now we're at our halfway point. We're coming to the famous South Pass. Has anybody been to South Pass? Oh, very good. Known as the Gateway of the West, actually first discovered in the early 1900s, then rediscovered by mountain man Jedediah Smith in the 1820s. It's about a 15 to 30 mile pass between the upper reaches of the Rocky Mountains and the Wind River Mountains over here. And why is it so important? It's an easily traveled wagon trail because it's a very shallow grade that follows the Sweetwater River up until we reach in the haze. You know, I've flown through this place a half a dozen times. It's always hazy. I don't quite understand it. But right up here is the Continental Divide. So, of course, on the other side of this, the waters will be flowing to the Pacific Ocean. And the whole area here is just loaded with wagon trails. Now, this is BLM land, so you can kind of drive around it if you care to, and I did. I'm actually standing in the swale right here. This was erected sometime in the latter part of the 1800s. If you look very carefully, I don't know if you can see that. You see these scars up here? That was the passage of many wagons over this Continental Divide right here. So now we're going to continue over a fairly dry stretch. I think it's called the Sandy River. And then ultimately we're going to reach the Green River right here. And you can see some of the wagon trails over here. And then we're going to head down to Fort Bridger. I didn't even need my GPS to go down to Fort Bridger. All I have to do is follow the wagon ruts down there. Got to catch them in the right kind of lighting conditions. But it's amazing how well they stand out. Fort Bridger, named after the famous mountain man Jim Bridger, was a resupply depot. There was a blacksmith shop, so you could fix your wagon and resupply. Jim Bridger actually wasn't here. He left the running of it to his wife and a friend of his. Jim Bridger spent most of his time being a Army Scout by this time. So from this point, the Mormons, we'll talk about this more, went west along I-80, but we're going to travel north to pick up the Bear River. But before we do that, we are down here at Fort Bridger. Now, later on in the trail, people began to build shortcuts which were not well surveyed. So, unfortunately, they were not well watered either. So you're really taking a risk by taking them. One of the more famous ones is the parting of the ways. We go in this direction and we go to Fort Bridger. We go in this direction and we cut off about 40 miles and end up at Coffill. Later on, the U.S. government built the Lander Cutoff, which went all the way to Fort Hall, and they actually graded the road. And that road actually goes through Star Valley. If you've all been up to Jackson Hole, you've driven through Star Valley, through Afton, for example, and then all the way to Fort Hall. The Lander Cutoff was much better watered. Okay, we are now here, and we're going to now make our way to Fort Hall. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to follow the Bear River. I took this picture just north of Bear Lake. And Mount Superior, Idaho is up in here. Many the pioneers said, gee, why do I have to go to Oregon? This is great land up here. I'm going to settle right here. And that's what they did. They just homesteaded in this pretty valley and at other valleys along the way as well. And the river continues northward until we get to Soda Springs. Soda Springs geysers are driven by the same hot spot that drives Yellowstone. So these waters are pretty hot. This was a sacred site to the Native Americans. The pioneers basically used it to cook their water. The pioneers had never seen anything like a geyser before. So you would often hear them say, now I've seen the elephant. Back in these days, an elephant was a rare occurrence at a zoo. So seeing the elephant meant, now I've seen everything. See a geyser like this. From this point, here's the trail. We can go around Sheep Rock Point and head southwest and pick up the California Trail, if that's the direction we're going. Or we can continue northwest to Fort Hall. This is a replica of Fort Hall. It's not in the actual location that the original one was in. Fort Trading Post established by Nathaniel Wyatt, sold to the Hudson Bay Company, and this was their basis for the claim of the Idaho territory. The Hudson Bay Company kept very good records, so we have the blueprints for this fort. So this replica was built exactly to the way it was back in the 1830s. So what you're seeing is pretty much what the fort looked like. Let's talk a little bit about Indian encounters along the trail. To the pioneers, an Indian was an Indian was an Indian. But in fact, we're going to travel through 30 tribal lands, where each Indian tribe is a little bit different customs and different languages. So it's always good to have a mountain man with you who knows something about the Indians along the trail. In the beginning of the travel, the Indians were very friendly. They helped the pioneers cross the rivers, and they traded buffalo or fish for goods. But the Indians didn't realize that the pioneers would keep on coming year after year after year. And what happened was that our livestock is eating all the grasses, the same grasses which attract the buffalo and the deer that the Indians live off of. So fundamentally, we drove away the animals that they subsisted off of. And that led to a lot of tension and finally outbreak in the Plains War. If you were to travel across the trail in the late 1860s, it was a very hazardous thing for you to do. We're now coming on to Shoshone Falls, the Snake River. This gorge and this falls were created by a geological event that I think most of you are familiar with. Lake Bonneville, about 14,000 years ago, filled up most of Utah. In fact, I think the waters were sometimes 1,000 feet deep, Great Salt Lake. And there was an earthen dam in Preston, Idaho, which burst, and the waters just rushed down the Pocatello Valley, hit the Snake River, and the waters were estimated as high as 50 feet and traveling maybe 60 miles an hour. And they scoured this area over here, which led to these falls, and dug out this gorge over here. So while there's plenty of water here at the Snake River, the difficulty is getting to it. And we're going to stop here because this is the upper reach of the Salmon River, and the Shoshone and Indian harvested salmon here. They're more than happy to sell it to us or trade it to us for different goods. Right, a little bit further up, about 50 or 60 miles southeast of Boise, Idaho, we're going to come to a decision point, Three Island Crossing. Has anyone been to Three Island Crossing, by the way? Yeah. It's really kind of interesting. You have a choice here. You can continue on the north side, but that was dangerous because the grasses were very poor. It's pretty dry. So we're putting our animals at risk. Or you can take a chance and you could cross to the north side, which was much better watered. And about half the people did that. And to do that, you would basically hopscotch from island to island to island. But this was a very hazardous crossing. There were no dams back then, of course. So if there was a thunderstorm upriver, waters would come rushing down there and they would overturn the wagons. We're going to continue following the Snake River, but then the Snake River turns way north into northern Idaho. We're going to veer off on modern-day I-84 towards Seattle. Say again? And Portland, right. Thank you. Portland. Right. We're going to come around a place called Flagstaff Hill. There's a great interpretive center here. And here we're going to get our first glimpse of the Oregon Mountains over here. And the Oregon Trail is right here, which crosses across this very fertile valley. So this is another place that many of the pioneers said, this is good enough for me. I'm going to stop right here. And finally, we are going to reach the Columbia River Gorge at a place called the Dells. Here, the Hudson Bay Company charged you a very expensive toll for the time, $50, to help guide your wagon down the Columbia River Gorge to Portland. You would have to follow the shallow waters. Many of the pioneers were just terrified. This trip, it took about 4 days until ultimately we got down through the Columbia River Gorge. To Fort Vancouver, run by the Hudson Bay Company. And this, by the way, was the fort, which was the basis of the claim that the British made for the Oregon Territory. It was run by a gentleman by the name of John McLaughlin, who was actually very generous and welcoming to the pioneers. He related to their saga. And in fact, he could see the handwriting on the wall. So later on, he decided to become an American citizen. A little bit further south, which is our final destination, he founded Oregon City. And he's now known today as I think he's known as the father of Oregon. Last stretch, not many miles to Oregon City. And of course, our goal is this rich farmland right here. What's interesting to me is this farmland is really from Montana. There was another glacial event about 12,000 years ago where a dam broke and the waters rushed down the Columbia River and flooded south of Portland. So these are Montana lands over here. So we made it. Congratulations, you're thrilled to death. But unfortunately, you're exhausted, you're impoverished. You may go to the local office to get your plot of land, but you can't work your land until the springtime. So what are you going to do? You had to make do for the next 3 or 4 months. And you did that by either working at a sawmill or maybe working at an established farm. Anything to make ends meet until you can begin to work your land. A little later on, a very enterprising man by the name of Sam Barlow decided to cut a trail that went south from the Dells, around Mount Hood, and all the way to Oregon City. and he charged only $5 a wagon, much better than the rafting trip and much safer. So the pioneers began using that particular route. That trail still exists if you're willing to go into the backwoods and look for it. And there you can actually see some grave sites of some pioneers. Can you imagine you're within 50 miles of your destination and you die? This particular gravesite has a little bell on top, which you ring to summon the angels on behalf of this woman who died here. Okay, so we made it to the Oregon Trail all the way to the Portland area. What about the Mormon Trail? Well, going back to Fort Bridger, the Mormons would go west along I-80, and then they would travel north a little bit on I-84 to Hennifer. Then they would travel south along Utah 65. They crossed the mountains into Great Salt Lake. And just for fun, I decided to fly that particular route. If I played that back to you in real time, it would take a long time. So I decided to speed it up by a factor of 10. So what you're going to see now is what you're going to see if you're traveling at 2,000 miles an hour on an SR-71 at Mach 2.5. So buckle your seatbelts, and I'll try to guide you along the trail. Okay, that's East Canyon Reservoir over there. And now we're going to turn up the mountainside and follow the trail. There we go. A little dizzy, isn't it? And then we're going to turn left over here to Little Dale Reservoir. And then into Immigrant Canyon. Now, here's your Jeopardy question for the evening. Were the Mormons the first ones to carve this trail? Oh, but you guys are pretty good here. Who did? Yeah. Donner Party. Yes, the Donner Party. In fact, this delayed them by a month, which was the cause of their horrific winter at Donner Lake. Yep. And here we came to the end of the Mormon Trail, where Brigham Young, of course, declared that this is the place. Let's talk a little bit about the California Trail. There were many California trails. One, of course, was to go into Oregon, then go south to California. But another was to follow the Hastings Cutoff. The Donner Party was following the Hastings Cutoff. Another one of these examples where it was poorly surveyed, so you really didn't know what you're going to get. To follow the Hastings Cutoff, apart from going over those hills that we saw, you have to go over this dry lake bed. Wendover is over here, so this is I-80. Very treacherous stretch of the trail. And what you're shooting for is the Humboldt River. This picture was taken near Elko. Very, very water place. But unfortunately, the water ran out when you came to the Humboldt Sink. This was basically a swamp, a mud area. And unfortunately, many of the animals got stuck here and died. And it was said that at certain times of the year, the trail actually went over dead bodies of the oxen to proceed along to ultimately Donner Lake and up a number of switchbacks to Donner Pass, and finally to Fort Sutter, Sacramento. Just at a point of interest here, this is the cut for I-80, modern day I-80. And this over here, anyone want to guess what this is? Say again? Right. Those are the tunnels for the Transcontinental Railroad. And they're kind of fun to hike in. I don't know if anyone has had an opportunity to do that, but I really enjoyed that. When Meriwether Lewis came back to see his sponsor and dear friend, Thomas Jefferson, he spent the whole day going over the trip. And when that was done, Thomas Jefferson sat back and he said, my God, it's going to take 10 generations to fill the West. Well, in fact, it took only about 2 or 3. The first were the mountain men, and the second and third were the pioneers who risked their lives just for the opportunity to seek a better life. They were ordinary people who did extraordinary things. And since that time, going west is always synonymous with seeking new opportunity. And I think that's still the case now. Thank you for your patience.
Okay, so we're going to take some questions if you'd like, but we need to talk into the microphone so the recording can pick it up. So I'll pass it around if anyone has a question.
Yep.
Okay, I just have a comment. We happened to go to the reenactment of Three Island Crossing by accident. We did. And they do it. I just looked it up. The second Saturday in August is usually when they do it.
Where's this again?
Three Island Crossing
Oh, the Island Crossing, yeah.
on at Glens Ferry. They have a big party. They invited us. We stayed.
Do they still drive wagons across
They
there?
do.
They do, huh?
Mhm.
Yeah, they stopped that for a period of time.
Symbolically, I'm not sure they take many. Maybe just one to make sure it makes it. I don't know.
Yeah. In my earlier versions of this presentation, I have a snippet of them crossing those rivers. And the waters were very fast. So you could see as the wagons, which were being guided, by the way, by horses and helped by Indians, coincidentally, would turn around and sometimes totally turn around and get swamped, even though they unloaded the wagons to pull them across. It was really a daunting crossing. Yes.
When you mentioned that they stopped at forts for resupply, how were those resupply points supplied?
Oh, well, I think actually there were, I'm guessing this. Wait a second here. Maybe I should try this over here just to make sure. No, I don't really have an answer to this. I think basically the whole West was resupplied by trains. The mountain men started that. They had rendezvous in different places along the West, so it was not uncommon for them to have wagon trains bringing supplies to different places. And that continued past the mountain men era. Anyone else?
The question was, were there many children?
I'm guessing yes. I mean, we don't have the records, but I'm guessing the average age were probably, the man and the woman were in their 30s. So they probably had young children. It was not uncommon back then for a woman to have 7 children in the hope that some of them would survive and take care of you in your old age. That was Social Security back in the 1800s. So, they probably had plenty of children along. Yep.
How many months a year do you pay to you fly over the yard and did?
Well, I did it in piece this time. One summer I would go to the Oregon Trail, then I would go to a mountain man site, and then I would go to a Lewis and Clark site. So all told probably 10 years to cover everything. But I did not do it continuously. Yeah, I stretched it out. Yes.
There's a thing there, this thing that over, I think the 6th graders called on to Oregon.
It was written by a woman who made it with her brothers and sisters. Their parents did not make it. They made a terrible movie out of it. I'd never seen such a horrible movie in my life. So I always read the book to the kids. But it's a very interesting book. The kids end up trying to make it on their own, and they do.
Yeah, they do.
They make it. And the book is partially, it was told by one of the girls. The sad part was eventually after they got there, I think most of them got killed in an Indian raid.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing what people will do if they really have to. Yeah, this is an interesting book. Has anyone read The Travels of Jamie McPheeters at all? I highly recommend it. It's a fictional story, but it was based upon actual accounts, actual journal accounts of a young man who traveled along. And so you get to experience the trail from the perspective of a young man who's coming of age. So it's a fun book. It's a fun book to read. It's somewhat humorous. Anyone else? All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you all.